Now we are transitioning over into our East meets West part of the talks in this track. I told you this would be a hybrid of looking at Britain, but also looking at East meets West. And we are joined now by Marco from JoyPac, who's going to be talking about the hyper-casual phenomenon in China. Hi, Marco. How are you? You're on mute, which is a normal for Zoom.
There we go.
There we go. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Very good morning to you.
You too. Where are you coming at us? Is it morning where you are?
It is morning where I am. I'm in London at the moment.
Oh, you're in London as well. Oh, well, yeah, thank you for joining us this morning. And yeah, we're looking forward to this talk. I won't take up too much of your time. I'll let you get started now, though obviously we'll have the full time. But while you get yourself set up, share your slides, all that sort of stuff, I do want to remind everyone here that yes, like you can see in the picture that Katie's changed, we're now onto the East meets West. So as I said, this is going to be looking at China, the hyper-casual phenomenon and how to break into that market. But also, you're probably going to have some questions for Marco. So make sure I'll clear the Q&A in a moment. Make sure to throw your questions into the Q&A and I'll come back at the end and go through some questions with Marco. And also make use of the chat and make use of the live captioning, the subtitles. Anyway, Marco, over to you. I'll let you get on. I'll drift off into the background, but I'll be back at the end and we'll go through some questions from the audience.
Cool. Thanks, Sophia. Good morning, everyone. Great to be here. So what I thought I'd do today is talk a little bit about some of the market trends that have been happening in China as of late, particularly surrounding the hyper-casual sector. I think there's been a number of different talks about how to enter the market, some of the constraints in entering the market, which are all very interesting, but there's been a few kind of interesting trends that have happened in the past year that's made it a lot more interesting for anybody who's looking to maybe break a hyper-casual game in this market. So I'm going to be covering a little bit about the market and also how a little bit how hyper-casual differs out there. I'll discuss briefly about the dynamics of the app stores, which is very different out in the West, also some market constraints, and also as a final parenthesis, maybe why you should maybe consider Joypack to help you if you have a potential game that you'd like to port out into China. So a little bit about me. My name's Marco. I'm one of the senior publisher managers in the Western publisher team at Joypack. This is my 7th year in the gaming industry. I'm a gamer through and through. I grew up playing a lot of console games, particularly the N64 and the PlayStation 2, probably showing my age. But if you've also been around in the industry, you may have seen me working for some of these companies that have surfaced on this slide here. I used to be a part of the Facebook Instant Games team back in the day. And prior to Joypack, I was working on building out the game distribution product in something a little bit different in gaming. I was in the HTML5 space. But I joined Joypack about 4 months ago. And yeah, very happy to be there. And this is the company I work for, Joypack. We're a hyper-casual publisher. We just publish hyper-casual games. That's our speciality. That's our niche. We actually originally started out just in the Chinese market, but now we're pretty much global. We have offices in Beijing and in Copenhagen, and we have a remote team throughout Asia and Europe. I myself are based in London, and we have colleagues based in Turkey, the Netherlands, also in Germany. And we've been having some successes for sure. I mean, our mandate as a publisher is essentially to cast developer ideas into market hits. We have a fairly different approach on working with hyper-casual developers. Rather than working on a game-by-game basis, we have a program called Hyperfuel where we actually work quite closely with studios. So we try and work on building out studio hits as opposed to game hits. And we've had some really good successes down the past year. So we're now topping just over 150 million downloads. We've had over 10 games in the top 50 charts. And yeah, our hit base is, as we expect, it's going to continue to grow through this year as well. But back to the Chinese market, generally, it's massive in short. And to put that into perspective, it's a $25 billion mobile gaming market. And China is now worth about 25% of the world's mobile games market and is continuing to rising. And to put that into a contextual understanding, in the US, mobile games amounted to about 18 billion. after experiencing a growth of just under 20% during the pandemic-stricken year of 2020. And in 2021, revenue from mobile games is projected to increase a further 12% in the US and almost double in China. So it's by far the number one biggest mobile gaming market in the world. There's close to now over 200 million iOS users. That's approximately just over 20% of the market share in China. There are, like to put that also into perspective, that's about double of the number of iOS users that are currently in the US. Of the remaining is Android, and there's over 500 million of them. And the two leading handset providers for those is Huawei and Samsung, which cover about just over 50% of that market. And hyper-casual games is by far has been the fastest growing segment in the past year. They weren't that popular in China compared with the US market, but the Chinese top charts were essentially mostly filled with mid-core and role-playing games. But lately, we've seen a lot more hyper-casual games climbing to the top charts, and it's the fastest growing game category in the mobile gaming market today, by far. And if we talk about some of the factors that have contributed to that growth, there isn't one kind of nodal point that stimulated the hyper-casual interest in China. There's been a number of different factors. I mean, first and foremost, there was, I don't know if you guys remember, I mean, it was quite a while back, but there was the great kind of licensing freeze that kind of slowed down the overall Chinese game market in 2018. And starting in March of that year, games could not be approved for release in China. And to make things even more difficult, the Ministry of Education issued a lot of recommendations to reduce playtime in teenagers and things like that. There was a lot of concerns about game addictions and things of that nature. But that had been lifted about just over 18 months ago, and more games are starting to come into the fray in the Chinese market. And what we actually saw initially was a big kind of growth in the mid-core gaming category, whereas much of the rapid growth of the Chinese market in previous years was driven by overseas publishers. We started to see domestic developers taking a share of that success. And the most notable highlight of this is Genshin Impact, which launched I believe it was September 2020, and became the world's most profitable mobile game in the space of about just under a month, by a developer called Mohi Hoho. So we started to see a lot of big domestic developer successes. And what that meant is actually quite a close parallel to how things went in the West with the hyper-casual group. What mid-core games allows the hyper-casual genre to do, it gives them more kind of availability and space for these games to advertise with these games. There's a lot more inventory now from games for these games to surface on. I mean, the other thing was the COVID-19, the stay-at-home measures in China and also throughout the world, which began in January 2020. I mean, this is a trend that we've seen pretty much in every market globally, but in China, consumers were spending about 30% more time on their mobile phones daily compared to the daily average in 2019. That's a very substantial amount. So, and just to snowball through all this, there's been a number of kind of east to west investments. We've seen kind of investments from Tencent, making moves into the hyper-casual space. We've seen a lot also other hyper-casual publishers opening offices out in China as well. So we've seen a significant kind of actual corporate financial investments into the market from players in the West and the East. So with the causes come the effects. So China's domestic mobile game revenue was up just over 30% year on year. It was $29 billion in 2020, and that was an increase of 30%, which is massive. It was actually the highest annual growth rate for China's domestic mobile game revenue since 2017. And towards the end of 2020, it was reported that hyper-casual games were leading at least 72% of total sessions played globally, and a lot of that was coming from China. In fact, China was the biggest contributor of that growth followed by the US. And what does it mean for hypercasual? Well, hypercasual is growing really fast in China, and the appetite for hypercasual games have surged. And probably the #1 biggest benefit from the cascade that's come from these massive kind of stimuluses of demand for games in the market. At this time, approximately 25% of games in the top 20 and 30 iOS in China are hypercasual games, and that's doubled year on year. If you look on the Android side, the share is much, much higher. So more people are playing hyper-casual games than any time in history. And the highest increase in downloads for hyper-casual games came from China, growing nearly 4 times during the pandemic, which is massive. And the interesting thing is, again, this kind of parallel with how hyper-casual kind of springboarded in the West a few years ago. There's been a big emergence of mid-core games in the market, which is really helping the genre to continue its growth trajectory. As I say, there's a lot more inventory now available for players to advertise their games across, the leading ad networks in the market. In fact, just off the press, one of our sister companies, Mintegral, which is a leading ad platform based in China, reported an advertiser growth by just under 30% in Q2 compared to Q1, and also an increase in 15% in publisher apps utilizing the platforms. There's a lot more demand and supply on the ad networks in the Chinese market. But with any big stimulus and growth, competitive forces now come into play. So yeah, there's more chart-topping games now coming from the West in the China market, and also it's attracting a lot more local development. It's starting to come through in the region of some of the low barriers to entry of building a hyper casual game. The low cost, quick production times, and now more available outlets of publishing funding in the market as well. So it's attracting a lot of local development within the market. So despite the growth, we're now starting to see more players in the space, which we will probably see a lot more kind of competitive angles as this year plays out. I thought I'd now segue into some of the game differences to what we see in some of the kind of traditional hyper-casual games with some of the domestic partners in China. And one of the questions I always ask our China team is like, fundamentally, how does games differ out there in the East, very in the West? And the conventional answer I get back is, "Oh, Marco, usually we have games that's a bit more polished and a bit more layered mechanics to it." And it's a very, very vague answer I get back most of the time. But to give a bit of pragmatism to that answer, I've kind of showcased here 3 examples of what that actually means, and I definitely recommend to go away and have a look at these 3 games, because it does show it does give kind of some signs of how these games differ out there in comparison to the West. And starting from the left, the first is a really interesting game called Master of Sword, which was published by Zplay. And what you have, this is a really satisfying kind of sword grinding game, which has got these lovely visual kind of haptic effects and immersive sound effects. And what I would kind of speculate is that if this game was out in the West, it would just be that. It would just be this kind of grinding game where you kind of tasked with kind of molding together these swords. But it's actually got a few layers on top of it. On top of the grinding, you have you're then tasked to actually cut certain segments of items, and you actually have a lot of item unlocking, which adds kind of like a number of different kind of components to the game as well. The one in the middle there that you see is a game called Violent Speed. It's from a developer called Games Lion, and it's kind of like a car-themed infinite runner game and it's got like a kind of stampede rodeo undertone to it. And what you'll notice by this game is that there's a lot of visual feedback as you're kind of progressing down the runway and avoiding cars and clashing with enemies as you run down the highway, and it's quite striking. The other one is Beat Blader 3D, published by Ammonotes January this year. It's a runner game, and what you'll see with this runner game is that there's a lot of kind of neon effects and bright kind of contrasting colors, which is actually quite a prominent feature for games out there in the East. It's a very kind of attractive art style. And if we were to have a look at some of the games that we're seeing that are quite popular from other developers from the West, you'll see that they've incorporated some of these themes. So if you look at on the left, Queen Bee by Rollic Games, which I think at time of writing it's about, I think it's positioned at 27th in the China iOS App Store. You'll see that it's kind of like one of those, you know, from just looking from the visual, it looks like a classic kind of beauty wall game that we see out in the West, but it's got a few layers to it. It's got this really interesting kind of social media mechanic to it, which you're then tasked with taking selfies and things of that nature to kind of increase reputation and things like that. In the middle, you have Voodoo, Wo Shen Sei Zai Bang, I believe is the translation for that name by Voodoo. And interestingly, they've chosen a bear there as the lead kind of protagonist of that game. And I don't think that is something you would necessarily see in the West. And it's an interesting choice there. And the last one is Hair Challenge by Rollic Games, which I believe is currently 43rd in the top 50 in the iOS at the moment. And you can see there's a very striking, prominent kind of neon glow, which augments kind of the art style to that game as well. So we're starting to see Western developers kind of picking up some of the nuances that you see that are more kind of to taste in the Eastern market. So in terms of entering the market, you know, the three kind of main things you need to consider before you tackle a market like China are these kind of top three buckets. Like firstly, it's channel management. It's a very different landscape to how things are in the West. We conventionally have two app stores that share maybe over 90% of the market in Google Play and the Apple App Store. But as you look into China, the Android landscape in particular, it's extremely fragmented. There's between I think 8 to 10 different leading Android app stores in that market today. The second thing to think about is localization. So the previous examples given, you can see that localization is much more than just translation. And if you think you're going to walk into China with your existing title and not make any changes, I'd advise to think again. I mean, the real key to success there is the ability to adapt your product to local tastes. And that's something that we do really well at Joypack as well. And lastly, and not least, is the regulatory requirements. There's quite a few kind of policy considerations that need to be had, not only with publishing your game in the market, but also working with partners, certain partners to distribute your game, where some partners only working with kind of Chinese incorporated businesses, and that's a real constraint as well. So starting from the bottom is the legal challenges. So in China, to publish a game with IPs, you need an ISPN certificate, and this applies to both iOS and Android. And applying for an ISPN certificate can take anywhere between 3 to 6 months. It's much harder if you're a foreign developer to apply for an ISPN certificate. And there's also other local licenses as well for other regions within the market that need to be considered. So it really helps working with a partner who's out there in the market and understands that framework. It'll save you a lot of time and hassle in doing so. The other thing is localization. So yeah, so I mean, it's everything. Having a local partner to guide you on how to create your advertising material is very important. So it's not only the game itself, it's also how you advertise the game to the player and tell your story about the game, and also the ad creator being that mechanism that teaches the players how to play the game. But also thinking things like local holidays, having the right creative sets for regional holidays like Chinese New Year, those things can be really, really effective. And even like small things like changing the characters to match these holidays, or modifying content colors, or even the apps icons. All these things need to be considered and have proven to be really effective from the work that we have seen and done importing games from the West to the East. And this is one of our leading examples of a game we worked with from a studio called Usaya. And the game in question was Tofu Girl. They had a hyper-casual mobile game that was already a big hit in Japan. And they wanted to publish the game in China too, and we worked really close with them to make that happen. it's interesting because despite the geographical proximity, the Chinese and Japanese gaming markets are very different. And Tofu Girl was a very high performing but quintessential Japanese game. So we worked really closely with this developer, and there was a couple of two key things that we did to make the game more kind of applicable for the Chinese market. One was like adding this kind of rocket and shield items mechanic to the game, so players had access to extra gameplay tools once they reached a high score. And we also had a challenge mode as well, where we kind of unlocked new kind of Tofu Girl outfits and game skins by completing enough levels in the game. And they're two really strong appeals for Chinese players. So this was a really big hit for us. I mean, we managed to generate over 20 million downloads within China for Tofu Girl. Back to the channels. So as per the West, everything is channeled through the App Store, and that's becoming more consolidated in the App Store. We had experiencing some issues within China with regards to kind of like jailbroken devices and hacky things like that, and these are becoming less and less common these days. And pretty much, if you want to get the game out on iOS in China, you need to work with iOS as well. The other side of the coin is the Android market, and that's a really fragmented space. There's well over 8 stores that cover about 90% of the market, and they all have their own kind of nuances with varying SDKs that you need to integrate to have the game published on there. So it's a very busy place. And yeah, and last but not least, as a final parenthesis, is ourselves, JoyPac. We are a West to East partner, and we work with a number of different developers through the course of the year. Not only developers, but also publishers as well, in helping to get their games out into China, and all with great success as well. And yeah, if you have a game that you're interested in getting out to market, or would like some advice as to what some of the kind of adjustments or modifications that we would recommend to your game to get your game to be more suitable for the Chinese market, don't hesitate to reach out. We'll be very happy to help and entertain your game idea or your current game to get it out there. And that's a wrap. If you have any questions, feel free to fire away. These are all my contact details. So if you have any questions on any things I surface on the material, or if you would like to maybe even get a copy of some of the article references to some of the data which I surface on there, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'd be more than happy to share it with you.
Fab, thank you, Marco. We do have some questions, and in the interest of time, I'm going to dive in because it was a really fascinating talk, and I think people want to try and, eke out a few more details. So yeah, the first question we've got is, several hyper-casual publishers are focusing now in building an early relationship with developers. How does Joypack differentiate themselves from the others in this aspect?
Well, we do the same thing. We work very closely with a number of different developers at Joypack. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, we have a program called Hyperfuel, which is a program where we work very closely with developers, and not only just building out a hit game, but building out a series of hit games and working on games on a prototype basis. But I think when we're looking at market differentiation, I mean, we started out in the Chinese market, and we've been in that market for a long period of time, so we know the market very well, and all the nuances that there are associated with that market. So I'd say that partnering with someone like Joypack, you're essentially partnering with a depository of knowledge of a team that really understands what it takes to get a game out there and to get a success out of it.
Fantastic. I'm going to just jump to one of the other questions here, because I think it's a really interesting question. Is in your opinion, which is easier, to adapt a Western game to the Chinese market, or to work with developers who have a Chinese market in mind from the start?
Oh, yeah, good question. I don't think there is a preference there, because what we're starting to see, particularly if you look at the top 50 games, free games in China, you're starting to see more kind of Western themed games come in, maybe with a few kind of nuanced modifications or adjustments to make it more kind of palatable for the Eastern market. And that's a trend that's going to continue through the course of this year. And I think, when you're always thinking about, with hyper-casual, you're always thinking about the base idea. The base idea has to be strong. And then the other kind of layers to it come after. So kind of like market adaptability, all those nuances you can consider at a later stage. So my advice would always be to always think about your core idea of the game first, and then think about market adaptability later when it comes from China.
Okay, great. And in the spirit of that, someone throw, if a developer wants to work with hyper-casual games in China, what are the main trends and design aspects they should keep in mind? Is there, I mean, I know that's kind of like the topic of a whole talk, but is there any like quick things that you would say, like, you've just got to think about this, for example, like one touch control or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, the same kind of parallels of how you approach hyper-casual as a design in the West, it certainly applies to the East. The only considerations I would highlight at this stage is the nuances, kind of the nuances to the market, and making sure that you think about those. And it's very difficult for you to anticipate what they are unless you work with a publisher that kind of understands on the ground what those nuances are and what those trends are. Because those trends also change at a very fast pace, as it does in the West, as it does globally. So working with a publisher is really key to that, so you understand some of the trends in that market as well.
Fantastic. We've got two questions left that I think I can squeeze in just about. So the penultimate one I've got is it easier in China for hyper-casual games compared to other genres? Like, is it easier if you're wanting to break into China to make a hyper-casual game, or are there still equal opportunities in other genres, do you believe?
Yeah, there's two sides of that coin. I think we're seeing a lot more room to distribute your hyper-casual game in China. There's a lot more domestic developer interest in building hyper-casual games out there in that market. So there's a lot more angles now to distribute your games, your hyper-casual game out there. Particularly what we're seeing in the mid-core stuff, because the mid-core games are really growing at a fast pace out there. So that gives a lot more ad inventory to advertise your games. And it's probably the biggest opportunity we've seen on that front for quite some time. But in that respect, there's always a very kind of dark shadow to that, because that essentially lends itself to more kind of competitive forces. As with any opportunity that's available, you're going to start getting more players in the market, which we're going to see through the course of this year. So competition is going to apply and is going to take into effect. So just be mindful that, it's going to be a lot more competitive in the next 12 months.
Fantastic. And the final question, which I think is a nice way to end, is someone's put, how can developers join your program? How can they get involved with Joypack?
Yeah, just apply on our website. We have an application form that you can fill out, and just fill that out, and one of the members of the team will pick it up, and we'll be in touch. And conventionally, we usually just like to know a little bit about your studio, what games projects you've got currently ongoing, also to get a good idea as to what kind of ideas you have in hyper-casual, and we can ascertain and entertain whether there's a good fit for you to join the program.
Fantastic. Well, yeah, that brings us nice and neatly, is what I was trying to say. Nice and neatly to time. So thank you so much, Marco. Thank you for sharing that. I know it's a really hot topic at the moment, and everyone's obviously considering China. As someone who's been there numerous times, you can see the potential in the market, but also how very, very different it is to the rest of the markets in the world. So thank you for those insights.
No worries. It's been my pleasure. As just a final parenthesis, my schedule's pretty much open this week, so feel free to anybody who's watching this talk just to send a meeting request in my schedule, and if they have any more questions, I'd be happy to to talk directly with anybody.
Oh, fantastic. Well, there you go,
Cool.
everyone. You've all got access to the Meet to Match. So go find Marco and get a meeting booked in.
Cool. Nice one, guys.
Fantastic. Thank you, Marco.
Take care, Sophia. Ciao, ciao.
Bye.